Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending where you're from. My name is Mark Dudgeon. I'm the Senior Publisher for Theatre and Shakespeare Studies here at the Arden Shakespeare, which is an imprint of Bloomsbury Publishing. I'd like to welcome all of you to our workshop today, entitled Inside the Arden Shakespeare, Publishing Your First or Second Book. During our workshop today, we hope to demystify the process of publishing with Arden, offering tips and guidance. So thank you for joining us today. Our workshop lasts for an hour and will be recorded except for the Q&A. So if you do need to leave before the end, the recording will be circulated to everybody who's signed up. Just some practicalities before I introduce our panel. You'll see that microphones are muted while we listen from our speakers, but please make use of the chat function. And towards the end of today's workshop, there'll be a time for questions. So any questions that are raised in the chat will be addressed in the Q&A. Or at any point, you're welcome to raise a hand, turn your camera and mic on and ask a question directly during that session at the end of the workshop. In our panel today, I'm joined by Jade Grogan. So Jade is commissioning editor at the Arden Shakespeare. And I'm also joined by two of our Arden authors, Dr. Ella Hawkins, who's Senior Lecturer in Research and Innovation at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama here in the UK. Ella is author of Shakespeare in Elizabethan Costume, Period Dress in 21st Century Performance. And also joining us is Dr. Amrita Dhar, who's an Assistant Professor of English at Ohio State University in the US. And Amrita is co-editor of the forthcoming book, Shakespeare in the Post-Colonies, Legacies, Cultures, and Social Justice. Both Ella and Amrita will be sharing their insights and their experience of putting together a book proposal and of the publication process. And I should also mention in the background, we have Vivian Quick, who's Marketing Manager for the Arden Shakespeare, and Vivian's going to be making sure it all runs smoothly today. But first, Jade and I are going to introduce our areas of commissioning and then provide a few tips and guidance about putting together a book proposal. So if you don't know, the Arden Shakespeare list considers the world and the work of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. It covers roughly the mid-16th century to the Restoration periods. My own publishing ranges across critical studies of Shakespeare's work, including contemporary performance. It covers everything from research monographs, edited collections, course books, and larger reference works. I welcome proposals for books that may fit into an existing series or which might be a standalone title.
Yeah, and hi everyone, I'm Jade Grogan, commissioning editor for the Arden Shakespeare list, as Mark said, and I've been working here for nearly 2 years now. I commission research monographs in early modern studies, as well as working on the forthcoming Arden fourth series of Shakespeare's plays, poems, and sonnets. These are the annotated fourth editions of all of Shakespeare's works, which we first started publishing in 1899, making this year Arden's 125th anniversary. So I'm really keen to build up our representation of early modern studies on the list, where we have previously been more solely focused on Shakespeare studies, given the name. To this end, I'm interested in publishing research into gender and sexuality in the early modern period, studies of racialization and race making in the early modern period, and lots more cutting edge subfields within the discipline of early modern studies. So to start us off, we thought it'd be useful to know who is on the call with us. If you can tell us in the chat what stage you're at. Are you a PhD student? Are you working on your first book, looking to publish your second? Maybe just pop that in the chat so we can get a sense of where you're all at for this conversation that we're having around first or second books. Happening, if people want to do that. Yeah, great. So now this section, me and Mark are going to go through a few quick key tips, guidance, publishing your first or second book. We have some questions prepared, and we're going to talk through these just to get the webinar started before we talk to Ella and Amrita. And you'll also have a chance to ask your own questions afterwards, but this is just to get us going.
Thank you, Jade. So I'm just going to pose the first question to you, which is kind of the most basic of questions, but fairly fundamental as well. And that's, how should someone go about submitting a first book proposal to Arden?
Yeah, so I think maybe the first question to ask yourself when you start thinking about submitting a book proposal is, am I ready to submit a book proposal? Maybe you are still finishing your thesis, as some of you on the call, or you finish your thesis, pass your viva, but you know there's more research you want to do before turning into a book. Maybe you've already published your first book and have started work on your second. At Arden, we mostly review detailed book proposals by academics who have been awarded their PhDs and currently even always hold a research position at a university in the department their PhD is in. Though this does not preclude someone without those credentials publishing with us. As you'll see from Ella and Amrita, they were at quite different stages when they published their books with us or submitted their book proposal. So not every academic has the same background, and that's absolutely fine. But once you can confidently say, yes, I am ready to submit my book proposal and have the research on which it's based assessed by your peers, you could think a bit about what academic publishers you know and like, i.e. the Arden Shakespeare, we hope. Take a look at their author information page is probably a good place to start. Find your subject area, the relevant editor commissioning in it. You might find the proposal form there online, choose to download it, fill it in straight away. Or, as a lot of people do, you might send a querying email to the editor, explain that you plan to submit a book proposal, and check they are the right person and that actually your research does fit with what's currently being published on the list. So that brings us to proposal stage. Mark, as the editor receiving the proposal, what do you look for in a first or second book proposal?
Thanks, Jade. Well, our proposal form includes a range of questions, and those questions are designed to capture all of the information needed to assess a proposal. So I should say also, it is helpful if a sample chapter is available, particularly in the case of a first book. But when assessing a proposal, I'm looking for answers to a few key questions. First of all, and crucially, how is the proposal offering something that's original, new, and distinctive compared to the publications already in the field? There's no point recycling knowledge or material that's already out there. So it has to be offering something new and distinctive. And associated with that, why you as the author? Why is the author qualified to be the author of this work? And that can be evidenced by in a number of different ways, of course. So the author's thesis may be on the topic being addressed, and it may be accompanied by a supporting statement from their supervisor. That's often requested, particularly if it is a first monograph based on a thesis. Or that authority and qualification to write on the subject could be evidenced in a different way, could be evidenced by you having related peer-reviewed publications, such as journal articles or chapters in edited collections. So the first thing is about what's new, original, and distinctive, and why are you qualified as the author? Secondly, how does it relate to and build on existing literature on the topic? There ought to be a really clear sense of how you are situating your work in relation to related publications. The competition section of our proposal form is therefore critically important. It's one of the things I look at after the initial overview in most detail, because it helps me to understand that you've got a really good understanding of the field of secondary or scholarly literature, which it's a part of. And it also helps to clarify what makes your work distinctive in relation to that related literature. Thirdly is the content, the organization, the use of case studies, and the examples. So how do all of those different aspects match the overarching aims of the study? So there ought to be a logic to the structure of the chapters and the overall organization. Each chapter should be contributing to a clear argument or to the objectives you set out for the study. Likewise, your choice of case studies or the examples should help to substantiate the claims or to support the overarching aims of the study. It ought to show also an awareness of the needs of an international readership as well. So all of our Arden Shakespeare publications, they are intended for an international readership. They'll be marketed and sold around the world. So it should be clear in the proposal form as well. And perhaps in the choice of case studies that you incorporate, how you are articulating and seeing this work having application for readers in other countries besides where you're writing from yourself. So those are three large areas. The final one, perhaps, is how does the project suit our list in particular? How does it suit the Arden Shakespeare list? Does it match the areas we're actively publishing in? Is there perhaps a series which it fits? Or if not, as will often be the case, are there nevertheless related publications that demonstrate that it's a good fit with our list? So those are the four big questions I'm looking to see answered as I read it. Now, Jade, if I can put a question to you, because building on that, further consideration is the intended readership of the work being proposed. And this is something authors have questions about very often, is how should someone explain the book's audience or the readership on the proposal?
Yeah, so for a research-based proposal, you should think about who your academic peers are, as Mark was saying, and make sure that your proposal captures the breadth of research being done in your specific field. I think a good way to accurately represent the audience for your book is through the related books and relevant courses which you are asked to highlight in the proposal. You could think about the different studies and books that you've engaged with as an academic reader throughout your career and how you're pitching your own book within that framework. It's always best to avoid language which overstates wide-ranging appeal and speaks about the general reader, unless the book is actually meant for a non-academic audience. For Arden, we mostly publish academic research, as well as some practical studies and the annotated playtext, but we very much sit in the academic part of the larger Bloomsbury company, which publishes a wider range of books for multiple audiences. So it's always worth properly situating yourself and your book within that. So speaking of audience and academic peers, Mark, might be a good chance for you to tell everyone a bit about Arden Shakespeare's specific review process.
Okay, so how a proposal or sample chapter are reviewed. Yep. So when it comes into us, whether it's Jade or myself, the first stage of that review process is our own assessment of the proposal and perhaps, as I said, a sample chapter as well. So we'll be that first filter. What I mean by that is we'll be reading through the proposal with those questions in mind that we've already outlined, and also reading through all the information. And we'll give you, as the author or editor, initial feedback or raise any questions which we feel need clarifying first of all. We'll therefore give you some indication of what we feel the next stage is. So that may result in a revision to the proposal if we feel certain things need clarifying or teasing out in more detail. But once we feel it's ready for external review, the next stage is for us to solicit at least 2 external peer reviews from experts in the field. We follow a single blind review process, so the reviewer will be aware of your identity and your qualifications to write the book. We allow, on average, 6 to 8 weeks for those reviews to come in. Of course, it's always dependent on people's availability, so sometimes it can be less than that, sometimes it can take a little longer. But on average, it's about 6 to 8 weeks. And once we've received those reviews, we'll then digest those, we'll make our sort of assessment of the overarching sort of recommendations based on what that feedback is. The reviews will then be anonymized, and then they'll be shared with you, the author or editor. And together with those reviews, we'll include a summary of any recommendations and guidance about the next steps. And the next steps may be a subsequent revision or answers to specific questions, just so we're clear on how you're implementing any suggestions or recommendations. And then we'll outline the next steps with you when we feel it's then ready for that. Hopefully that's helpful, just setting out briefly the review process. Now, one thing that's come up a lot and is increasingly of interest I know to many authors, is about open access. Now, I should say this is an evolving and ever sort of changing field or opportunity. But Jade, perhaps you could just briefly outline publishing open access with Arden, whether that's possible, and any things people ought to bear in mind.
Yeah, so I think this is something that quite a few people who registered for this event were interested in knowing more about. So the answer is yes, you can publish your research open access with Bloomsbury. Our open access research books go through the same review press as our other academic books. The key difference is that you should have funding in place from an institution or grant when you propose your publishing open access with us. So it's worth raising this as early as possible with your editor and understanding what funding is available. Publishing your research open access can also be mandated by the body that funds your research, such as UKRI in the UK context, which quite a few of you might be familiar with. So it's worth knowing what your funder specifically stipulates. We actually have a whole OA team at Bloomsbury that work across the academic division to facilitate open access publications, and we can always call on their expertise if you do want to publish OA with us. And there's also a lot more information on our website, author pages, if you do want to look into that a bit more. And also, I think there was a link on the Eventbrite page. So yeah, if you ever want to ask about it, do just get in touch.
Thanks so much, Jade. So that brings an end to our little sort of overview of some tips and some guidance about putting your proposal together or what you might be considering. At this point, I'd like to bring into the conversation our guest author, Ella Hawkins. So Ella, thank you so much for joining us. Delighted you're able to, and thank you for the tips and the insights that you're going to be sharing with us today. So Ella, your first book, which we had as Exhibit A earlier on, was Shakespeare in Elizabethan Costume. It came out on the Arden list in 2022, first in hardback and then in paperback 12 months later. So I think this arose from your thesis. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that sort of process from converting your thesis into the book proposal and then subsequently.
Sure, yes. Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. So I was in my PhD Viva, which was in June 2020, which, as you can probably think back, was a tumultuous time. It was on Zoom, and we had a conversation after I'd had the result from my examiners, and the question was like, what next? Will this now become a book? And both of my examiners immediately said, oh, you should do Bloomsbury Arden. This would be a great fit for that publisher. So I was quite fortunate in that I didn't seriously consider several different options of where to go in bringing my thesis to print. So I went straight to Bloomsbury and was fortunate to be to have my proposal accepted. So that's how it all started. I had a very quick turnaround, I think unusually fast from thesis to publication. The Viva was mid-June. I submitted my proposal the very end of July, so just a month and a half later. I have a list here, so I checked the dates beforehand to see what that process was. And I did have to submit a draft chapter with that. I was offered a contract the beginning of October, so just a few months later, and then had to provide my full draft to Bloomsbury by May of 2021. So I had a good amount of time to make those revisions. I had the thesis I could immediately propose as a monograph with an idea in mind of what that would involve, and I had time to make those changes. And then it came out in June, exactly unplanned, the exact date of my Viva, in 16th of June 2022. So I was exactly 2 years from Viva to publication. And in terms of what I had to do to the thesis to make it into a monograph, I was lucky to not have to do an awful lot to it. First of all, I had to shorten it slightly. So my word count for my PhD thesis was 80,000 words, not including footnotes or bibliography. And my word count for the monograph was 80,000 words, including all footnotes and bibliography. So that was a sort of once over process of trimming all of the things I could trim without substantially changing the argument or the content. So that was one thing I had to do to the entire book. There was also a very slight bit of reframing that I did in the introduction, because the monograph was less about ticking boxes for getting through the PhD and more about, I suppose, telling the story of my research. So I sort of really streamlined the parts of the introduction that were sort of literature review, the bits that were really going into detail about defining terms and justifying my approach, and the sort of perhaps the more philosophical, justification for things I was doing. I really streamlined those things and just made it very clear what kind of story I was telling, what my argument was, and how that distilled down into my different chapters. Besides that, I didn't have to do an awful lot. I did have to lose many, many, many pictures that I had in my thesis that it wasn't possible to bring through to print because they're so expensive. Just to have the rights, a thesis stage for me, I didn't have to purchase any image rights at all because I was using them for an educational purpose. I got a grant from an organisation called the Passold Research Fund because my research specialises in costume and dress history. So that's an organisation that specialises in that. But I got 700 or so pounds, so I could include about 15 images in my book. Versus, I think it was literally something about 80. In my thesis, I went absolutely image mad because it's such a visual topic. So that was something else. I had to be very thoughtful and selective about how I was going to reduce that number and also pay for them. So there are many different organisations out there, topic dependent, that will pay for specifically publication of images. So that's something else to consider too.
May I ask, because of that sort of trimming of images down from 80 in the thesis down to perhaps just 15 in the book, did that lead to a change in the case studies as well? Or how were the images being used in the thesis? Were they more illustrative rather than being sort of with case studies being built around them?
Yeah, they were more illustrative. There were places where I could very easily, if I was talking about a portrait that's in the National Portrait Gallery and I was mentioning it in passing because it was a reference used by a costume team for a costume that was my primary thing that I was talking about, I could give all the information and someone could just go and look up the original portrait. So there were ways around doing things like that. And often I was able to describe what I was talking about. It was, I think, important that I had as many images as I could afford, but I ended up I talk about 15 productions and I have one image per production. So it was just being very selective about the image that would say the most and capture something about what I was writing about in words.
Thanks, Stella. I mentioned earlier about sort of case studies and sort of writing for an international readership. Was that an aspect of your original thesis, or did that have to be built in when you wrote the actual book?
Case studies was built in as I was writing my thesis because it was a very production focused thesis in the first place. So it was very much about that anyway. So I didn't have to change anything about what I was writing about. Interestingly, one of my reviewers came back recommending that I write about a production that I hadn't written about. And by chance, I'd actually talked about it briefly in my conclusion because it would happen more recently than what I'd spent the majority of my time working on. So that was something that came up in reviews that I wasn't expecting. It's like, oh, you should also talk about this one. So that's something to perhaps expect about recommendations for including additional material. In terms of the international appeal, I didn't change the content of my book for that purpose, but it was a very important part of the framing process for writing my proposal. My book is specifically about UK performance, and so it would have been a very big change, and it would have felt an afterthought to add a chapter that just explored the same issue in different contexts, and it wouldn't be possible to do it well. And so it was more about thinking, for the proposal, how can I pitch this? The same issues apply elsewhere, and the idea perhaps that if I'm writing about Royal Shakespeare Company productions or Globe productions, actually those recordings are internationally available, people are watching them, and so an international audience does have interest in these productions despite them being from the UK. So it was a real interesting thought process, and it's one that I found, I suppose, one of the more challenging aspects of the proposal, or a bit that I spent a particular amount of time on and got advice on from supervisors and from peers. Yeah.
Thanks, Stella. That's really helpful to just think about how it can be framed. It may be focused on UK case studies, examples, but there's a way of framing it and articulating its application to a readership without assuming too much knowledge, perhaps of particular references, etc. as well. Is there anything that you'd like to say about the copy editing process or about sort of your input on the cover? So once it's gone into production, what might you then encounter, and what was how much say did you have about the cover?
Well, I was surprised, first of all, about how much say I could have about things, I suppose. I was sent on the subject of the cover. Bloomsbury sent me, I think, about 5 different cover options. And quite cheekily, I said, can I have this one instead? And just sent one that I designed myself. And that was the one we ended up going with, which was very nice of you to let me do that. I suppose I'd had like a vision in my mind, and because it's like a design focused book, that none of the ones that the designer had come up with felt quite right. So I was very happy about that. In terms of the copy editing process, that was also something I was surprised about how much control I had over. So I had a great relationship. I love that I had an editor that I was in touch with throughout the whole process at Bloomsbury. And then for the copy editing part, it was handed over to a different team. And I again had a dedicated person, and that was great. I had a relationship with them. It all happened quite fast in that once it was handed over to that team, there was, I think, a 2-week period that I was given to do all of my proofreading and all of my index creation. And I didn't know far in advance when that would be, but as soon as I knew, I could block it off in my calendar. And I could write back and say, actually, I have an enormous marking load at the moment. Would it be at all possible to have an extension on that deadline? And that was not a problem at all. So I was happy that I'm not very good at asking for things like that. So I was happy that I did and that it was always fine. So it was a very quick process. And ultimately, I always had final sign off on all corrections and typos, which makes me very anxious because I feel afraid to open the book now in case I notice something, because it would be my fault. But at the same time, it was nice to know that whatever goes to press is what I have approved. So there's a lot of, ownership of it.
Thanks, Hella. You've made it all sound super efficient and sort of completely sort of unscathed by the whole experience. Paints a very sort of rosy picture of things. Can you just say, perhaps finally, is there anything which you wish you'd known at the start of the whole process, which you know now? Maybe it is around that quick turnaround and blocking out 2 weeks. I don't know, but anything else you'd like to reflect on, which you kind of wish you'd known at the outset?
Two things. One is that quick turnaround time. I didn't know when it was going to be, and it ended up being over a sort of holiday period. And so that was something that I wish I'd known sooner, so that I could have absolutely, planned my holidays around that. So that was one thing that I wish I'd known sooner. And it's just the way that it worked out. It's just the time of year that it goes through the process. The other thing is that there was a slight cover printing alignment issue on the first batch that I was sent. And so when I got it out of the box, I was like, oh no, the title's not in the center where it should be. And I wish I'd emailed you sooner to just say, oh, by the way, there's a printing issue, because I assumed they'd all gone to press. There was a box of books, and then that was just it. Whereas actually, because they're printed to order, you just emailed back and said, oh, no worries, we fixed it now. Here's some replacements, and now they're fine. So sort of mentioning any issues to make sure they get resolved is something I wish I'd known sooner.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I'll hand over to Jade now, and she's going to ask Amrita questions as well. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Mark and Ella. That was really great. And yeah, I'm very pleased to welcome in Amrita Dhar now, who is one of my editors. So you have a slightly different proposal to talk about than Ella's, a different journey. Could you start us off by talking about the process of drawing together a proposal for the edited collection you're working on?
Thank you. Again, thank you for having me here, and thank you, Mark and Ella, for that conversation, which I learned a great deal from. Can you all hear me? Thank you. Perfect. So I am co-editing a volume called Shakespeare in the Post within quotes, Shakespeare the Post Colonies. And it was deep within the pandemic in 2021 that a dear friend and collaborator of mine, Dr. Amrita, who is at the University of Calcutta, and I offered at the Shakespeare Association of America a seminar by that name, Shakespeare in the Post-Colonies. And we had this completely packed seminar, very exciting conversation. This was the one SAA meeting where the SAA, because of access reasons during the pandemic, forgave conference fees, and the conference was held online. So bizarrely, it became a brilliantly open thing all of a sudden, where people really from all over the world came to this particular seminar that we were offering. At the end of the seminar, one of the series editors of Shakespeare, of Global Shakespeare Inverted at the Arden Shakespeare, actually approached us to say that we probably had a book on our hands. And it was kind of amazing to have that moment where there was this peculiar, brilliant match between why Amrita and I had thought of offering such a seminar in the first place, and then a series editor at the Arden Shakespeare telling us that this very likely was a new and distinctive enough work to merit its own book in the world. So we loved the idea, of course, and to create the proposal, we spoke to friends and community across about 5 continents so that we could imagine in some kind of detail the wide and deep readership that we wanted to engage for our book. And we had a very pleasant exercise thinking of the kinds of courses across the world that this book could be used in, and so on. And that's how we got started.
Amazing. It's a really great origin story. And yeah, a lot of our edited collections do come out of conference chats. So it's always worth being open to publishers approaching you about that, definitely. So how have you found it different to what would be a single authored proposal? And the amount of people you've worked with, contributed collections can be quite wily things. So could you talk us through that a bit?
Yeah, yes. This is the first book that I am co-editing, and I am in the process of creating my first monograph. So it's all very first to me. So, it's working with this many authors across this much of the world has been a gift. Having a project that makes this necessary has felt like a gift. And the fact that we have been able to engage writers from a huge range of career stages, because some of the contributors to this volume are highly established scholars, very, very widely published. And then we have some authors for whom this is very likely going to be the first academic writing pitched to an international audience. And it has actually felt amazing to be able to undertake this journey with a publisher, with Arden, and to feel genuinely supported in a new kind of venture, writing for a new kind of scholarly audience, while also having to learn kind of on the job that the scholarly audience is different in different parts of the world. In fact, that scholarship itself looks different in different parts of the world. And being open to the idea of working for that kind of deep access internationally.
Yeah, amazing. I think this series, Global Shakespeare Inverted, is the perfect container for this research. So it's so great that it ended up being a part of the series. Obviously you were approached, but what made you feel confident in Arden Shakespeare and Bloomsbury specifically as the publisher to go for? I think it might be interesting for people on the call to hear about that.
Yes, totally. So again, it felt amazing. It felt I think we were very fortunate in having that interest from the publisher. But there are always, aren't there, practical considerations that a scholar needs to take into account. And at the time of making this proposal, I was very early career. I was, as I still am, an assistant professor at a Research One institution in the US. And at a Research One institution, the expectation for a person to have tenure is that they will have a monograph published and they will have a series of articles, possibly an edited collection or a co-edited collection and so on. And in my case, the one deeply practical consideration was that it felt very good to think of publishing with a publisher that my Research One institution's review committee that would consist of dancers, theater practitioners, physicists, public relations, international relations, from many disciplines, that they wouldn't have to Google this publisher to find out what we're talking about here, that it had cred. And this was an important practical consideration in my case. Then, of course, there was the more scholarly consideration that this really does fit the publisher and it fits the series so perfectly. And in those ways, it felt like a complete no-brainer to say yes.
Perfect. And yeah, I think Ella gave us a really nice overview of the timeline for her book. I thought you could also do the same and tell us a bit about when you'll submit. I think you're due to submit your manuscript, which is exciting.
Yes, it's exciting and nerve-wracking, and we're at that point where we've got our fingers tightly crossed, like everything will come together. So our process has been in so many ways, and I was listening to Ella talk about it, that it's the opposite. It's totally the opposite because, this thing was conceived within the pandemic when life was happening in such disruptive ways to so many of us that even made it out alive of it. And death was happening around us I grew up in the so-called third world. I now live in the so-called first world. And I always think that life and death and how the rhythms of life and death go really sort of do define the so-called first versus the so-called third world. Just how many people, close friends and relatives, we lost as we were putting this proposal together the proposal was a good thing in our lives, that it gave us something to work towards, thinking of something that should come out of a deeply traumatic time. But yes, things just took very long because of how much life was happening around us and death. And then multiply that by 15. When you have 15 contributors, and this, I guess, is, again, this was my first time, so I wish I'd known how much time it can take. Having this many contributors is a gift. Having this kind of a range of voices is a thrill. And at the same time, there is the consideration that this is happening while we all live our lives and look after people around us who may be living their lives or dying around us. So, not to be morbid about it, but that this just has been the reality of this project from the start.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very accurate depiction of doing an edited collection and all of the things that come up when doing it. So you've done incredibly well, and we are very, very excited to have it coming in the next month and to publish it next year. So everyone will be able to get a copy. But thank you so much for talking us through the book. I think it will have been as fascinating for me, even though I know you and the book, as everyone else on the call. But now we're going to move into our Q&A section. So we hope that there are a few questions in the chat. I'm going to hand over to Mark just to say about the Q&A now.
Yeah, thank you, Jade. And Amrita, that was wonderful and very moving as well. So thank you for sharing what you did, Amrita, and for your hard work on the collection. We really appreciate it. We have this time of Q&A now, so we have about 15 minutes, which is great because we have built this as a workshop. We really want people to be able to pitch the questions, the difficult questions, or those uncomfortable questions, or those ones which they're just sort of burning questions which will help you in your process. I've just been looking through the chat, people at different stages, some people putting together their first book proposal or completing their PhD, others with some experience under their belt already, perhaps working on a second or third book. So whatever stage you're at, we hope that you feel able to ask a question to either to one of our panel or to Jade and myself. I'll be happy to answer that. Just to say, at this point, the recording will be finished. We'll stop recording to allow for those questions and for those answers to be given without it then being circulated more widely.